Let's crack open a time capsule. For decades, the poor have been clustered together in neighborhoods full of rundown homes. The cities are rapidly becoming overcrowded. Politicians say the country can't continue along this path. And they've drawn up a plan, a really, really big plan that will take years to complete.
The centerpieces are towering, state-of-the-art apartment complexes. They'll be loaded with modern amenities. And St. Louis will have one of the biggest of these projects. 57 acres with 33 buildings, each 11 stories high, almost 2,900 apartments. The massive project will be named after a famous black fighter pilot and a white congressman. This is 1950s St. Louis, and welcome to Pruitt-Igoe.
No one could pretend that public housing would solve all the problems of people inside. But at least the buildings would not mock their poverty or corrupt their hopes. In their own way, the American people built a revolution and expressed the determination that whatever its income, the next generation would not grow up in a slum.
That dream quickly turned into a nightmare. Crime, disinvestment, violence.
2 decades later, with cameras rolling, the Housing Authority blew the whole thing up. These are the ruins, a massive urban forest just north of downtown St. Louis and west of the Mississippi River.
So right now we're walking up a little gravel path that cuts through what's left of Pruitt-Igoe, and I gotta tell you, it's just surreal. When you look around, it's like these buildings were never here at all.
I mean, these trees are just towering over us, you know? There's a big power station in the middle of it. It's bizarre.
So not many people agree on the exact reason for why Pruitt-Igoe didn't succeed.
Yeah, but many people point to population loss, disappearing factory jobs, white flight, lack of investment. I mean, the list goes on and on.
But I tell you, what does seem clear is that the federal government is not going to be building any massive public housing complexes, at least not anytime soon.
Yeah, and right. And the housing policy that created places like this has become more and more fragmented since the 1970s. But recently there's been a big push to re-examine some ideas that have been around for a long, long time.
And to try and find answers for questions that have been around for an equally long time.
How do you make sure housing policies aren't deepening racial and economic segregation?
Or how do you pay for what's left of America's public housing?
And isn't a home supposed to be more than just a house?
Trying to answer those questions inevitably leads to more and more questions.
So, on this episode, we're taking a look at how the country is trying to redraw its master plan for affordable housing. We live here.
We live here.
We live here.
We live here.
A project exploring
race,
class,
power,
poverty,
systems and the people they touch.
I'm Tim Lloyd.
And I'm Camille Stanley. And from St. Louis Public Radio, this is We Live Here.
Fair warning, we're about to get deep into the policy weeds on this episode.
Right, and to keep you, and frankly us too, from getting lost, we've divided the show up into 3 big parts.
And every time we get to a new part, you're going to hear this doorbell. Yes, a housing show with a doorbell sound.
Yeah.
We're so clever on this show.
I know, but I'm just now getting it.
All right, we got to stop goofing around. So, part 1. Setting the ground rules.
Yes, and to do that, we need to go back to the Fair Housing Act of 1968.
The voice of justice speaks again.
Here's President Lyndon Johnson just after he signed the bill into law.
It proclaims that fair housing for all human beings who live in this country is now a part of the American way of life.
The Fair Housing Act of 1968 includes a provision called Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing.
It's a mouthful, so you'll hear people throughout the show call it AFFH. Basically, though, it's the government's way of saying that in addition to making sure people have affordable housing, communities must also have a plan that ensures fair housing and equal access to quality schools, transportation, and jobs.
And cities and counties that get federal funding for housing, which is like all of them, are supposed to be doing everything they can to make all those things happen.
Key phrase here is supposed to be.
Because over the last few decades, many cities just focused on the housing part.
AFFH really was a part of the fair housing program from the beginning, but it was the part that nobody wanted to talk about.
This is Will Jordan. He heads up the Metropolitan St. Louis Equal Housing and Opportunity Council, or EHOC. You may remember EHOC from our last episode. It's a nonprofit that contracts with the federal government to investigate housing discrimination.
But you would have cities that would fight it because what they thought they were being told is that they had poor people that were going to be forced into living next door to them. And they just didn't want that to happen. Or they had people of a different race, African Americans in particular in the St. Louis area, were going to be forced into moving into their neighborhood, and they just didn't want to see that happen.
Jordan says because of this pushback, the feds pretty much quieted down about AFFH until a year ago. Last June, almost 50 years after President Johnson's speech, the Supreme Court ruled housing policies that deepen racial segregation are illegal, even if officials aren't doing it on purpose. A month later, President Barack Obama signed an executive order that rolled out a bunch of new resources.
Things like data and mapping tools that housing officials and really anyone in the public can use to take a closer look at things like segregation and where subsidies are being used in their communities. And in a weekly web address, Obama echoed a lot of the things Johnson said about the importance of fair housing for all Americans.
In some cities, kids living just blocks apart lead incredibly different lives. They go to different schools, play in different parks, shop in different stores, walk down different streets. And often the quality of those schools and the safety of those parks and streets are far from equal, which means those kids aren't getting an equal shot in life.
Over the next several months, the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD, said it would be paying closer attention to the AFFH rule, and it ordered officials to consider best practices from across the country when they start making local plans.
We know, this probably wasn't something that came up in your Facebook feed last July, but trust us. This new rule, officials say, is a really big deal. And remember, it's basically asking people to do what they were supposed to be doing since 1968. So Tim and I wondered, what makes people think it's going to start working now?
Charles Bryson runs a department that enforces civil rights in the city of St. Louis. He says communities can't just acknowledge they have problems like residential segregation. They have to actually try to fix those problems.
And if you don't tell HUD how you're going to fix them with a very specific plan to fix them, they can withhold their money. Mm-hmm. And that is the new part of this that is so crucial, is now you're not just telling me what's wrong, you are telling me how you plan on fixing it, number one. And number two, please know that if I don't like your plan or you're not implementing correctly, I can withhold your funds. Mm-hmm. That's the two important tools that have been missing for decades.
So as somebody who's been kind of on the ground working in this area for a long time, what's kind of the insider's view? Like, what's the buzz around that? Are people scared? Are people,
I hope so. I hope cities and towns across this country are scared to death of the fact that they may lose money and they're going to do the right thing.
And housing advocates like Will Jordan, who we met earlier, say this isn't just about what's morally right.
Because the meat of the program is that opportunities cause people to not have to be on housing subsidies after generations. And so that's good for everybody. The United States of America wants to see people eventually become taxpayers, right? And that there's no way to get around that everyone is going to have to take a share in having these opportunities city by city, state by state, county by county. If everyone doesn't participate, then only a few will participate and you'll have another Ferguson. And that's really what AFFH comes down to.
So AFFH is sending a clear signal that the federal government is doubling down on its commitment to dismantling segregation. But the effects of that are mostly invisible.
That's because communities typically submit their housing plans to HUD every 5 years or so. So most folks in the affordable housing world say it will take a long time to know if AFFH will reach its full potential. In the meantime, the federal government has another problem on its hands.
Uncle Sam owns a lot of real estate. HUD says about 1.2 million households currently live in public housing across the country. And the repair bill for all those homes, many of which were built in the middle of the last century, is really, really big.
Yeah, like $26 billion big. And let's face it, when was the last time you heard a member of Congress saying the country needs to renovate public housing?
It's time for us to dive into part 2.
Allow us to show you around the beautiful, spacious, and very private rental assistance demonstration.
Now that's just its technical name, but its cool name is RAD. Here's our editor, Shula Newman, giving us a definition from HUD's website.
The rental assistance demonstration was created in order to give public housing authorities, PHAs, a powerful tool to preserve and improve public housing properties and address the $26 billion.
Did your guys' eyes just glaze over?
My eyes are totally glazing over right now.
I know.
Like drifting off.
Mine did too,
Yeah.
which is why we went in search of a translator.
Hi, my name is James Hanlon. I'm an associate professor of geography at Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville, and I'm the director of the Institute for Urban Research at SIUE.
So the first thing we did was ask Professor Hanlon to give us a brief history lesson about RAD and housing policy in America.
A brief history.
Is that if?
I mean,
Yeah.
do what you can.
Sure.
All right, so that brief history lesson wasn't actually so brief.
We'll give you the Cliff Notes version. Up until the 1970s, the federal government used to pretty much handle public housing all by itself. But for the last 4 decades, it's taken a 3-pronged approach, breaking up housing assistance into 3 big buckets.
The first big bucket is traditional public housing. It's run by local housing authorities that get federal dollars to manage apartments for low-income, elderly, and people with disabilities.
The second and third buckets, the Housing Choice Voucher Program and project-based Section 8, are public-private partnerships, where the government subsidizes rents in the private market. Now, the big difference between buckets 2 and 3 is that with the voucher program, the rental subsidy is tied to the person who has it, so a person can take their voucher and shop around. But with project-based Section 8, a subsidy is tied to the housing unit, not the person living there. So an apartment will remain affordable no matter who occupies it.
Now, by the numbers, traditional public housing, that's big bucket number 1, has become the federal government's smallest rental assistance program. Hanlon says that's translated into less and less attention in the budget.
Back in the early 90s, it was about $5 billion a year that Congress set aside for the capital fund to help maintain the physical condition of public housing projects. It's gone from $5 billion a year to less than $2 billion a year. So it's been cut by more than half. And at the same time, capital needs accumulate each year at about a rate of $4 billion.
And, listeners, this finally brings us to RAD.
Which, drumroll, is yet another push to privatize public housing. Maybe, Hanlon says, the final push.
Under RAD, local housing authorities can apply to convert their existing public housing stock over to project-based Section 8.
So, basically, private companies will start running these housing projects that were built by the federal government. In exchange, the private companies are responsible for repairs, which cost a lot of money, and upkeep.
And these private companies have to agree to keep these units affordable for at least 15 to 20 years.
There have been more than 30,000 housing units that have gone from pure public housing to this hybrid public-private model in the past 4 years.
Tens of thousands of other projects are waiting to be completed.
It seemed to a lot of people that this was a sort of a safe bet to move from one long-standing familiar program to another long-standing familiar program, with the idea being that you're going to have a more stable funding model. I mentioned that public housing funding has been dwindling. Mm-hmm. Congress has been actually increasing the amount of funding over the years for project-based Section 8 and vouchers too. So the idea is if we're willing to fund that program, but not willing to fund public housing sufficiently, then let's take the public housing and move it over here.
But it's worth pointing out here that even what seems like a safe bet is still a bet.
So as our expert, tell us, is this a big deal and is it a good thing?
It's a big deal in the sense that what we're in the process of doing is bringing to an end a program that started in 1937, the public housing program. It's been around a long time. It's had its problems. So what we're doing is saying we're not going to do public housing at all anymore. I mean, there probably will be some left over at the end of this process, but they're really looking at converting a large proportion of the public housing that's left. When you do that, it's hard to go back.
So you might think that a big shift like this would be big news. Fact is, though, that with few exceptions, it's largely happening without much fanfare. Hanlon says in some cases there are bulldozers and demolition crews.
In other cases, it's a crew coming in to put in a new roof or to update and modernize the kitchen or the AC or heating units.
Now, we should note here that St. Louis, where Camille and I live and work, doesn't have any public housing projects scheduled to undergo this type of conversion, but many other communities across the country do.
Reporter Lauren Gilger works for KJZZ, the public radio station in Phoenix, Arizona. She's been checking on a public housing complex there that's getting an overhaul this year thanks to RAD.
Hey, Lauren, how's it going?
Good. How you doing?
Good. So tell us about this complex.
So Kofelt-Lamoureux is like this small city in South Phoenix. It's huge. It's 38 acres. It was built in 1954 as low-income housing. It has 301 units, and when it's fully occupied, almost 800 people live there. Brian Swanton showed me around this complex. He's the Arizona market president for Gorman and Company. They're in charge of the renovation of the property, and he told me the place has been deteriorating for years.
It's really showing its age. The buildings are pretty solid, but they have old swamp coolers that are really inefficient. They use a lot of water. We have streets with potholes so large you could lose a small car in some of them.
So a few years ago, the county thought the only real option was to just demolish this place. But there are about 300 people living there. So instead, the Maricopa County Housing Authority sold the project into a public-private housing partnership with Gorman and Company. They're a for-profit real estate developer, and they work with local governments to redevelop workforce housing across the state. So they work on projects just like this. And they actually got the site listed on the National Registry of Historic Places, and they're coming up with $44 million to renovate it.
Wow. This is good news for the residents, right?
It really is, because when this whole deal first started being put together, it became really clear really quickly that the people who live there didn't want to leave.
Who are we to tell 300 households that, no, you have to move someplace else in the valley? So we felt it was our responsibility to try and preserve this property on behalf of the residents who wanted to stay.
Swanton also said they were worried about the balance of the community around it.
The mantra is that you don't have to move to live in a better neighborhood, and we've adopted that mantra. And we want to make this neighborhood a better place and make Kofelt a shining example of what redevelopment really can be.
It sounds like things are going great, that this is sort of like a miracle almost for this particular housing complex.
It really was for the residents there, I think. They really didn't want to leave, and it sounded like for a long time there they were going to have to, so it was a good thing for them.
Do you know if there are plans to do more RAD projects there?
I know that this was the first one in our state, but it sounds like Gorman and Company is interested in projects like this, so I wouldn't be surprised if there were more in the future.
All right, perhaps you're thinking people are pretty stoked about this RAD thing. You know, RAD is so rad.
You know, not really, actually. There's a lot of places that are not so thrilled with this RAD thing. Check out this video. It was shot a couple of years ago when community activists protested RAD outside of Baltimore's housing authority. In places like Baltimore, Minneapolis, and San Francisco, there's a history of tension between tenants and local housing authorities.
And many low-income housing advocates are leery of letting the private sector take such a dominant role in public housing.
No, it's like dangling a steak in front of a lion.
This is Demetrius Bonner, a public housing advocate from Chicago.
And in his analogy, the steak is public housing,
and the lion is private companies. We called Demetrius while he was in Washington, D.C., meeting with officials during the annual conference of the National Alliance of HUD Tenants.
We had been up on Capitol Hill all day, and we met with Maxine Waters, Congresswoman Maxine Waters, and we talked about the RAD program and how it's a failure. It's a plan to destroy and not a plan to rebuild. It's just disguised as something good, and the language makes it seem as if something good is going to come out of it, but it's not.
Demetrius says his chief concern is private entities who might be tempted to break their promise to keep these converted apartments affordable, especially if they're located in rapidly gentrifying neighborhoods. We heard similar concerns from other housing advocates. Demetrius says despite not being perfect, public housing, run solely by the government, still provides the best protection for low-income people.
I was born and raised in public housing. And we had all of the amenities that we needed. We had our own basketball courts, football courts, baseball. We had our scouting. We had YMCAs. Our schools in our neighborhoods would kept us out of harm's way. The stores was around the neighborhood. It wasn't a food desert, you know. So I do believe that public housing would be is a great thing because it gives people of low income, meager wages an opportunity to have their children go to school, pay low rent, and be able to escape this poverty situation.
So what would be your solution to how would you fix things?
So to fix this thing, number one, housing needs to be fully funded by our government. Number two, it needs to get away from privatizing. This whole country is going into privatizing, which takes away from the public stock.
Demetrius says it wasn't tenants who defunded these public housing projects and left them in disrepair. It was the people in charge of those projects. And he worries the same thing will happen with RAD, just under a different name. So if you've listened this long, then you must be pretty good swimming in the deep end of the housing policy pool. Before we get out, though, we have one more big shift in housing we need to tell you about.
Which brings us to part 3. Unlike AFFH, which was part 1, and RAD, which was part 2 of this show, there's no fancy acronym for what some people see as the answer to the third big question we posed at the beginning of this episode.
That question being, isn't a home more than just a house?
So rather than talk about this new approach, it's better to show you how it's playing out in places near and far, which is why we're waiting in a parking lot in North St. Louis County.
A big Midwestern thunderstorm is about to hit, but we're hoping it won't rain before we introduce you to this guy.
Hey, Chris.
Hey, Tim, how are you?
Good to see you again.
Good to see you again. How have you been?
Been good.
Good. Hey, Camille.
See you.
Good to see you.
This is Carolina.
This is Chris Krameyer. He's a middle-aged guy with a gray goatee, and on this day, he's wearing a suit and tie. Lots of folks around here know Chris through his work, running a nonprofit called Beyond Housing.
So Beyond Housing is a place-based community development organization who believes in the idea that home matters. And for us, it's, the physical place you live every day, but it's really about the life in and around where you live that we think fuels and draws the best out of the people that live there.
About 5 years ago, Beyond Housing launched an initiative called 24-1. It's basically a big collaborative, and in some ways, it captures the spirit of what AFFH, that policy we told you about in part 1, is trying to do.
Right, that fair housing is about access to quality schools, parks, transportation, basically all the stuff that makes somewhere nice to live.
And there's meaning behind the name, 24-1. The 24 part stands for 24 municipalities, and the 1 stands for the Normandy Schools Collaborative.
In other words, dear listeners, outside of St. Louis, there are 24 municipalities within the footprint of a single school district with fewer than 4,000 students.
Now, the Normandy school system has long struggled to raise academic achievement. It's also the alma mater of Michael Brown. And under the 24-1 initiative, Chris and his staff have been trying to get everybody on the same page and bring back the kind of businesses and services that disappeared long ago.
So where we're at now is the intersection of Page and Ferguson in the city of Pagedale.
And from this intersection, Chris points to the Save-A-Lot grocery store they helped open 6 years ago.
We've been averaging about 6% year-over-year increase in sales, which is significantly better than a lot of other grocery stores, both in the Save-A-Lot chain and in general.
Across the street, there's Rosie Shields Manor, an assisted living facility for people 55 and older.
And on the bottom floor of that building is a full-service Midwest Bank Center branch.
And last November, Beyond Housing opened its newest addition to the neighborhood.
We're standing right next to the 24-1 cinema, 4 screens, 325 seats, first-run movies. We've been open since November. I'm proud to report in April we had our first positive month. Yay. Yeah. Thank you, Barbershop The Next Cut. Did gangbuster business.
Yeah.
Ticket price at the movie theater are $7.50 and $4.50, the cheapest prices in town.
Why is it so important to have that movie theater? I mean, people I think understand a grocery store, senior living, a credit union on that line, but why a movie theater?
So when you think about the fabric of a place, it's not just the basics, right?
Mm-hmm.
Nobody wants to live in a place that just has the basics, right? People, guess what? They do go see movies. They do want to have entertainment. And right now, before the movie theater, they had to leave. They had to leave their community. So there is absolutely great pride when people come to their theater, right? It's called 24-1 because it belongs to the community, right? So at the end of the day, a fabric of a place is not just, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's fun stuff too, like movie theaters.
Beyond Housing also works directly with the Normandy Schools Collaborative, the local school district, to help get services to families struggling to make ends meet. The nonprofit does other things too. It helped open more pre-K facilities in the area and started a college savings program.
But Chris says at first, not everybody was on board with the idea of a housing nonprofit getting into things like business development and early childhood education.
When we developed the grocery store, a lot of my board said, whoa, what? We're going to do a grocery store?
Yeah, we just do housing, right?
Right. Well, come on. So it takes a willingness to see what community needs. Can you aggregate the capital to make it work? Can you be willing to be humble and say, I don't know a doggone thing about, running a movie theater, who the heck can help us, right? And be okay with people giving you guidance and, and figuring out, how to get that kind of work done.
So for Chris and his partners, it's about rebuilding a community. But in other parts of the country, it's about holding on to community.
When we were putting together this show, we asked some of our reporter friends across the country if this type of thing is going on in their town. Devin Katayama covers poverty and housing in the Bay Area, and you may remember him from our last show.
Devin told us about this project he's been following in Oakland, which has become a hotbed of gentrification in recent years.
And the project is worth watching because if residents can stay and local businesses can thrive, it could be a model for other cities with rising costs of living.
Here's the story Devin sent us.
Kokavula Lumaconda brings a small stack of books to our interview.
Okay, I got Negro Makers of History.
African American history is important to Lumaconda. When he looks out the window of his apartment in a building called the California Hotel, he doesn't see history as having treated his people well.
I haven't found a place that I can really call home yet in this American wilderness.
Lumaconda is one of 149 residents who live here at the California Hotel with the help of federal housing vouchers. The building sits at the northern tip of West Oakland. Outside there's blight and drugs, which is part of the reason why it hasn't attracted large development like elsewhere in the city. But Lumaconda worries time's running out.
Now with gentrification, all that is at risk. And it is as though, these economic pressures will overtake us, and all memory of what had gone before will pass.
If Lumaconda and others have any kind of chance of preventing that from happening, the nonprofit group called East Bay Asian Local Development Corporation, or ABALTSI, may be their best bet. ABALTSI has already invested more than $40 million to renovate the California Hotel apartments. Now they're trying to make the entire neighborhood a healthy place to live. And they're seeking community buy-in. Over the summer, they held a series of neighborhood events where residents were asked to think about what they wanted. Cherise Fong is Chief Operating Officer for ABALTSI.
Our way of doing it may be a little bit different, but I think there is a groundswell, frankly, in the country, but certainly in the Bay Area because of all the pressures on people, and particularly on low-income communities, to find new solutions that bring everybody on board to figure it out.
I was affected by this environment.
Raymond Maurice Edwards has been living in the hotel for about 3 years.
Just when you look out the window and you walk down the street and you see 20 needles and things like that, that's not a conducive environment for people to do constructive things.
Residents came together with a design team to think about what are some quick, guerrilla-style, projects that they could turn around and beautify.
As we walk down the block, Fong points out mounds of fresh dirt and new plants on the street median. Then we stop near a vacant lot next to the hotel. Fong says over the next few years, ABALTSI plans to build around 55 new low-income apartments here. Many of them will be for families. That's not so much a surprise, but what is new is what ABALTSI plans to do with the space in the meantime.
While we're waiting to build affordable housing, we're actually going to turn that into sort of a temporary community gathering space, potentially with pop-up marketplaces for residents who want to try out business ideas, to a performance space. We may have a temporary stage there.
That kind of experimenting is also what Baltzy is doing at the California Hotel building. It used to be a popular venue for famous jazz and blues musicians. There hasn't been music like that here for decades, but now residents can hear live music every third Friday. During the day, this hotel lobby is ground zero for a lot of support services that a lot of people need in this building.
You get some soup? You want some?
Yes, I do.
Every week, Heather Smith serves food and sets up this makeshift healthcare clinic where residents can come and get a reading of their blood pressure.
And keep track of it, their exercise, their activity level, what they eat.
Baltzy has worked hard to create numerous partnerships that have made the California Hotel what it is today. There are case managers on hand, and psych services, a computer lab, and a garden. And it's not just a Baltzy here. At a time when it's hard just to get affordable housing built, this is resident services times 10, as one employee put it. And the California Hotel is the anchor.
They can get information here and just sit down and we build relationships and build trust with folks in the community.
But will all this be enough to help improve the neighborhood for residents who live there now? Kokavula Lumakonda, who lives in the building, says the developers are trying to do the right thing. But everyone who wants to see this part of West Oakland improve is up against a city grappling with rapid change.
Do you think the hotel itself has a chance at being that anchor in the community, being maybe one of the few places that does make it through?
Well, we need about 2 or 3 more California hotel-size residential places.
If this experiment works, it may represent one of the few models of how an Oakland neighborhood was able to grow from the ground up.
You know, Camille, listening to Devin's story, it makes me wonder if there's any way to really measure whether or not projects like these are working.
I mean, my gut says yes. There has to be, right?
Yeah, I know what you mean. And Chris Krameyer says he gets this question like all the time.
If you recall, Chris is the guy who runs Beyond Housing, the nonprofit that helped open a bank, grocery store, and even a movie theater.
He says even after 5 years of doing this work, there's no single answer.
We think the track that we're on is all heading the right direction. Today, I can't give you giant community-level outcomes that have changed, right? But we think we have all the building blocks and all the foundational stuff in place. Then in the next 3 to 5 years, we're going to start seeing some movement. We're going to start seeing some changes.
Let's be honest, this is not always the most satisfying answer in this age of big data and instant results.
That's true, but Chris says there's something else you have to keep in mind. Even though Beyond Housing can rent out a 3-bedroom single-family home for around $675 a month, that's still out of reach for many, many people.
And this is where we come full circle. The demand for rental assistance far outstrips the subsidies that are available. In fact, just 1 in 4 households that are eligible to receive housing assistance actually get it, according to the Joint Center for Housing Studies at Harvard University.
So Chris has been playing around with a brand new idea. Basically a DIY version of housing vouchers that he could use to help stabilize families.
Is there any way we can create de facto a private label housing authority?
When somebody How would that work, though? Like, explain like the mechanics of what
So the mechanics of it is simply, again, it would have to be philanthropic dollars, right? I would need a big bucket of money that says I can pay for someone to go inspect the unit, I can pay for someone to process all the right paperwork to make sure we're working either with the existing landlord or with us to say, you pay $400 a month, we'll cover the other $200 to make sure our costs are covered. And I have a pool of money that says I can do this for 3 to 5 years, right? I don't want to do it for 12 months and then you got to go, right? That doesn't make any sense, right? So is there a way to say it just can't be, wow, I hope you get the subsidy and I hope you find the right place at the right point in time? That seems a terribly unsatisfactory way if we're going to help families in this region become stronger and healthier.
So it's almost like a private sector voucher system.
Yes, that's exactly what it is.
Have you ever pitched that?
We're in the process of trying to understand all the mechanics of that, but I'm going to be pitching.
You're working on the pitch.
I'm working on the pitch. On the pitch because, again, we turn down 90% of people who come to us because they can't pay.
This is our second show on housing policy, and we've covered a lot of ground. programming note that if you haven't listened to our first show, you should go back and check it out.
Yeah, you really should.
And at this point, you guys might have the same lingering questions that we do. Like, what does all of this mean? How do all these pieces fit together? Maybe they don't fit together.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of clear that there's not enough government money for affordable housing. And by all accounts, this public-private thing, for better or for worse, is going to be a huge part of the future. We also know that there's growing interest across the country to use affordable housing like an anchor to rebuild or hold on to communities.
But here's the truth. We're left with a conclusion that is honestly totally cliche in journalism circles and is a little embarrassing to roll out. But here's the cliche.
Only time will tell.
Only time will tell.
We know, not very satisfying.
All right, so one more cliche. Let's say history is the best predictor of the future. I know we're getting thick into cliches here, but if that old saying is true, then what the public wants will determine how this all plays out.
If the public wants to use affordable housing policy to break residential segregation, the tools and the enforcement mechanism are in place.
But the thing is, those tools aren't really new. And if the public wants to look the other way, no matter how the policies are made or what enforcement tools are in place, it's doubtful that all that much is going to change.
All right, diehards, it's your favorite part of the show, Cheesy Pugs.
Cheesy Pugs.
Yeah, if you like our storytelling or like our show, come hang out with us on social media. We're on Twitter at WeLiveHereSTL, or come to our website, WeLiveHere.show. If you're on iTunes, become a subscriber and leave us a review. We love them.
5 stars, please.
5 stars, and even comments. We read them.
Yes, we sure do. And if you're one of our good friends listening on NPR One, we love you. Do us a favor, though. Look down and hit that interesting button. That really helps us out.
Yeah, and if you happen to be in St. Louis next month, we're hosting a live storytelling event on July 12th at Herb Arts in St. Louis. The theme is I Live Here.
And you can find all the details for that live show at our website, which is, again, WeLiveHere.show.
Okay, we've got some special shout-outs.
First, thank you, Jim Kircher over at 9 Network. That's the PBS station in St. Louis, for helping us track down some archival footage. Also, Devin Kadiyama at KQED in San Francisco sent us a couple of great stories for our last 2 episodes. Thank you so much, Devin.
Lauren Gilger from KJZZ in Phoenix, who you heard in this episode. Thanks so much. And Grant Blankenship from Georgia Public Broadcasting helped us out in our last housing show. Thanks again.
So We Live Here is produced by me, Tim Lloyd.
And me, Camille Stanley.
Shula Newman is the editor of St. Louis Public Radio.
And Cassie Morgan composed our theme music. And from St. Louis Public Radio, this is We Live Here.
Support for this podcast comes from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.